this is Max Kaiser. Welcome to On the Edge. Let's turn straight away to Michael Krieger in Colorado. Michael Krieger, welcome to On the Edge.
Max, thanks for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. Thanks again.
All right, and Michael, there are many oil stories in the news this week. Obama is considering tapping the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. First, tell us what is the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and then what are your thoughts about tapping it?
So the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is an amount of oil that we store in the Gulf of Mexico in basically underground salt domes. And we have about 726 million barrels a day of oil currently in that. The idea behind the SPR is that in the case of an emergency, let's say an event like Hurricane Katrina, where a large portion of domestic supply or even global supply is knocked off the market, you can bring this on to basically serve as a buffer. Now, last week, there were reports that Obama was considering releasing oil from the SPR. And Jay Carney, the White House press secretary, also alluded to the fact that they were considering this. To me, when I saw that headline, I thought it was one of the greatest acts of really desperation and the inability to have any sort of energy or economic policy in the United States by this administration. And what I mean by that is that because this reserve is only supposed to be released in when there's a major supply disruption, exogenous event, for them to be talking about it now to me sounded really strange, especially since why didn't they talk about releasing it immediately after Libya's 1.3 million barrels, which is offline currently? When that went offline, they should have been talking about it at that moment, and they didn't. The other thing is, wasn't it just 2 months ago that Obama was putting on his attack dog, Eric Holder, to look into speculators? So my basic feeling on this whole matter is that the oil price is not cooperating with the administration and Keynesian economists' view of what should be happening. And they're basically freaking out because they don't understand what's truly going on, the issues that you discussed, that I discussed, which is the fact that the cheap oil is basically gone.
All right, so I just want to revisit this a little bit here because you said something that I think needs repeating. The Obama administration routinely attacks the speculators in the market for driving the price higher. But a simple analysis will tell you, as you've done here, that if they're just diving into the strategic reserve without this external event that they would usually associate with tapping into the reserve, it shows that they actually are at the place now in this cycle where they're running out of oil, right? So that's the basic conclusion we can make without getting too fancy about the analysis. It's just they're running out of oil.
Yeah, it's sort of like what's happening across the entire economic, political, and social landscape of the planet, which is that we're hitting this enormous transition point of, as you've discussed, peak credit, peak GDP growth, peak commodities in the near term. And so, but we still continue to have this fantasy of unlimited GDP growth, which truly shouldn't even be a goal in itself. But that's besides the point. That still is the philosophy currently in place. And what the planet is essentially doing, I think, is showing us via higher commodity prices, this isn't working. So to tap an SPR that would only last a little over a month anyway of total U.S. demand is just desperation. It's a very political administration that does not comprehend what's truly happening in the world, just looking for a Band-Aid, another Band-Aid. That's all that is.
Right, and of course, to acquire more reserves, the U.S. is engaged in a foreign policy where they're going into countries in North Africa and the Middle East to take control of their reserves, in Iraq principally. But of course, all the money that they spend to finance the war has the effect of driving price up due to the inflationary effect before this oil comes online. So in the short term, they're hurting themselves financially. And then in the long term, given the constant in the demand equation, there's not much of a long-term plan either. So they're shooting themselves in the foot in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. But I want to move on here. Last week, OPEC was unable to reach an agreement on production quotas. What's going on here, Michael Krieger? And in particular, Saudi Arabia claimed it's going to increase output by 10 million barrels.
Yeah, I mean, this is just an unbelievable story. It's a huge story. While it got a decent amount of press the day that it came out, this is unbelievably big. Let's take a step back and think about what OPEC is. Now, first of all, Saudi Arabia, as we all know, is the biggest exporter of oil on planet Earth. It's the biggest producer in OPEC by a long shot, Iran being the one after them. If Saudi Arabia, which is the only country with any spare capacity at all, really, meaningful spare capacity in the organization, is going out on its own, which, as you mentioned, they're saying that they're going to now boost their production from 9.3 million barrels a day to 10 million barrels a day. What is OPEC? I mean, does OPEC even exist anymore? I would question whether there is an OPEC, because what is OPEC if they can't agree to anything and then the one producer with spare capacity acts on its own? That sounds to me like Saudi Arabia has taken the organization over and it doesn't no longer exist. So I don't think OPEC exists anymore. That's my view of the situation. Now, the other thing that's very interesting about this story is that if Saudi Arabia does bring their production to 10 million barrels a day, according to the International Energy Agency's recent report, their total spare capacity is 12 million barrels a day. So while this might push down or nudge down oil prices a little bit in the short term, if you've only got 2 million barrels a day of spare capacity in the world, you've got a big problem. So in reality, this could actually be very bullish for oil prices, because people will look and say 2 million barrels a day. Well, we just lost 1.3 million barrels a day in Libya like that. So what if something else occurs in the world, which we all know it will, then we've got nothing. And then what happens? And then what will oil go to? If the Saudis need to then pump up to 12 million barrels, if they even can, what's the price going to do? It's going to go up to $150, $200 a barrel. We've got a big mess on our hands here.
All right, that's the supply side of the equation. Let's talk about the demand side of the equation for a second. The Economist magazine writes that in 2010, consumption exceeded production by over 5 million barrels per day for the first year ever, as world oil stocks were run down. Now, Michael Krieger, is this a hoax, or is this the rapid decline modeled and predicted by Hubbard back in the 1950s?
Right. Well, of course, Hubbard, was talking about supply. But to your question on the demand side of the equation, this is a huge part of the story that I'm glad you asked, because we've got these two things going on at once. We obviously have the peak cheap oil story, which is really undeniable at this point. It's pretty clear that's the case. All the big discoveries are basically, Canadian oil sands or very deep water Brazil. So that's all very expensive to produce. But on the demand side, you have this economic philosophy, as we've discussed before, Keynesianism, which has infected the entire planet Earth, essentially, which says that the ultimate goal of human existence should be nominal GDP growth. Okay. And since that's infected everywhere, China is trying to grow as fast as they possibly can. India is trying to grow as fast as they possibly can. Every single person in these countries desires a car, right? Desires the ability to drive. And their governments essentially have promised them that they're going to have these things. And if you look at it, the math doesn't doesn't add up. So you've got all these countries that are growing at fast rates. You've got the U.S. that's trying to keep its consumption steady. And there's just not enough oil to go around at the current prices or anywhere near that. If you want to start with the basis of this faulty GDP growth to infinity model, which I think is the root cause of the problem on the demand side. So everyone's creating money, everyone's creating credit to consume, yet the supply side is crashing. So you've got a really, really ugly collision between Keynesian false economics and supply issues on the commodities fronts, especially for oil.
All right, so you've got a finite supply of oil, which has reached its apotheosis in terms of peak oil, peak cheap oil. And you've got some demand destruction we can anticipate going forward. We saw when the price was at 147, recently there was some demand destruction in the U.S. So that's part of the factor that goes into figuring out the price going forward. But the other major factor going forward, and well, actually there's two major factors. One that you've already mentioned, which is the credit supply and the amount of credit. A lot of people will tell you that the credit markets expanded simultaneously with the oil market over the past 50 to 60 years. And during the 2007 period, we saw both peak oil and peak credit. But that leaves one major global variable to discuss. And this is where it gets the cross currents get a bit interesting, and we need your mind to help us sort through this. And I'm talking about the currency market. So first off, Chinese currency, the yuan, presumably if it strengthens against the dollar, as some are suggesting it can, then the Chinese are insulated to some degree with this rise in the price of oil as a stepping stone, Michael Krieger, on kind of talking about the currencies and oil going forward.
Yeah, okay. So this is something I've been writing about for years now. And what surprised me the most is if you look at a lot of guys, that make this argument about China's currency and that it's going to strengthen and that, they're going to take the commodity demand. What surprised me the most is, A, how logical that argument is. It makes sense. But B, the fact that the Chinese have been so cautious in allowing their currency to rise. So I think what you're getting at is that as we come to this point where the supply of available oil is not going to be enough to sustain extremely high growth rates in China and, let's say, even flat consumption in the U.S., someone's going to need to be able to take a greater share of the pie. Now, if you look at China, they're estimated to consume about 9.5 million barrels a day this year. The U.S. is still, around 19 million barrels a day. So, we're still basically double what China consumes. Yet, we're the one that's in debt to them. They've got all the money and credit. They've got all the manufacturing capacity. And yet, they're supposed to slow their demand? It doesn't make any sense. And the mechanism, as you mentioned, for them to take a greater piece of the consumption pie, in particular for oil, would be via the currency strengthening. However, they haven't done it in a meaningful way yet. So what China now faces is a giant, gamble. They don't want to do it because they're worried that if they allow their currency to strengthen too quickly, they'll kill their exporters and they'll have social unrest. But at some point, I think they're going to have to take that gamble. And I think we're very close to that point. So either they allow their currency to really strengthen and they take the share of global consumption from the United States and the West, or we get another 2008 scenario where just everything just craters into a black hole again, which we don't know what the outcome is going to be yet, but we're at that inflection point right now.
I want to move on to ask you about just a quick question. Bilderberg in Switzerland has just broken up. There's this annual meeting of Bilderberg. It's one of these global confabs like Davos or the G8 or the G20. And, of course, the question always comes up, is there a global currency in our future, a global central bank, as a way for these bankrupt countries to organize themselves and roll up all their bad debt into a new global lending facility? Any thoughts on that, Michael Krieger?
Sure. Absolutely, Max. This entire issue that you bring about, which consists of, as you know, in the United States, the distribution of wealth has become more and more separated between a very, very small 0.01% and everyone else. And what we see happening at the Bilderberg meetings and a lot of different things is this tiny fraction of the world that has accumulated all of the wealth and resources now is in the next stage at this moment. And that next stage is not let's get more. It's we've got it all. Let's secure it. So that's what the Bilderberg meetings, I believe, are about. That's what the world currency that they want to put in is about. That's what the World Bank and the IMF, all that stuff is about. Okay, we've got it. Now let's put a lock down on it. And obviously the corollary to that is the police state, which in the New York Times today, there was an article about the FBI looking through people's trash and anyway, like basically getting rid of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. So that's where I think we are. This is a big reason why I write. This is a big reason why I do these interviews, is because we are absolutely at this inflection point where people have to say to themselves, wake up, this is what's going on. Okay, not only have they taken all of the resources and wealth, but now they're trying to consolidate it and put in a police state grid so that people can never get out of their poverty. So that is my number one message, and there is still time to prevent this from happening, and I think we will. But that's what's going on.
And you also see the phenomenon of state pension accounts in local municipalities and their pension funds just simply disappearing. The states and municipalities saying, look, we just don't have any money anymore, and they're effectively going bankrupt across the country to add with the problems of unemployment and the problem of subsidizing growth at any cost using food stamps and other gimmicks that simply reduce the integrity of the currency further. Now, I want to get into something that you write about, which is an issue that needs some nuance and some finesse and some digging down into the data here. This is the spread between Brent crude oil prices and West Texas Intermediary. There's been this huge spread that's gapping. So tell us about what are these two benchmarks in the oil price, what's been their history, and why are they gapping so incredibly now?
Okay, sure. So for a while now, the issue with WTI is that that's crude at Cushing, Oklahoma, which is a landlocked crude oil. So when there's a buildup or a glut of inventories at that particular terminal where WTI is priced off of, you can't really export it or send it out in massive quantities. So therefore, it becomes a completely irrelevant benchmark for global crude oil. Now, here's what's interesting about it. If you look at other crude oil grades in the United States, and I'm going to pick one, for example, it's called Mars, which is a lower quality crude oil that's produced in the Gulf of Mexico. If you look back from the entire decade from 2000 to 2010, that price was always at a discount to WTI, always. And guess what? That price is now about a $14 premium to WTI. Okay, and that's a U.S. crude oil in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the reason is, of course, WTI is not actually what anyone pays for oil, except for a few refineries located in the region. So the key message that I want to make is that it actually not only is it not a good global benchmark, but it actually isn't even what prices crude oils in the United States. If you look at other oils that are of lesser quality in the Gulf of Mexico, they are trading closer to Brent. So it's really the WTI is just irrelevant. That's really the answer to the question. The other interesting thing, though, that I want to bring up is there's another oil price that I talk about. It's called Asia Tapis. And this is the same quality, essentially, of WTI and Brent, but it trades in Singapore, or it's in Singapore. And that's about $126 a barrel. So what's really interesting is not only is Brent at a huge spread to WTI, but then this Asian oil, where the demand is at a $7, $8 premium to Brent. So this, to me, blows out the entire argument that it's speculation that's causing oil to rise, because most of the oil, will be traded on the WTI futures or the Brent, not in Asia Tapis. Yet that's the highest price. So it's the whole thing with speculators is ridiculous, which is why now Obama is now saying it's supply and demand and wants to tap the SPR. They just don't understand the issue at all. That's the truth.
So the WTI, the West Texas Intermediary, you're saying is landlocked. It has a distribution issue that you don't have with Brent. And so is that market smaller, essentially? I mean, it seems like with this huge arbitrage in the marketplace would be filled at one point. How can this arbitrage continue to go down there? Because arbitrage of this magnitude is usually closed in some way. Is the WTI so small that there are just not enough players to close that arbitrage?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is a historical pricing relationship, remember. So, there aren't the pipelines. There isn't the infrastructure to take WTI oil from Cushing and send it across the country to refineries where, let's say, like a lot of the refining capacity in the United States is in the Gulf Coast region around Houston, Louisiana. You can't send that WTI in bulk to those refineries. There isn't the infrastructure to do it. So, yes, of course, it would be arbitraged away if it was possible to do it, but it really it isn't. The infrastructure is simply not there to do it. And also, as you say, yes, it's not I think the amount of oil that the United States has, crude oil in storage, it's around 370 million barrels, I think, a commercial storage. Cushing is a small fraction of that. So, yes, that's really what it is. It's a historical pricing point that worked in a different time, in a less global world where demand was, not centered in the United States as much. So, yeah, I mean, look, Max, there's been debate for years now, and I'm talking 4 or 5 years about getting rid of WTI as the U.S. pricing benchmark. So it's been a long time coming, but it's just getting worse and worse as time goes by.
Okay, so the takeaway here is that supply is tight.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and the key takeaway is, look, it serves the administration and others' purposes to have WTI trading below 100 because that's what most people that are ignorant look at in the United States. And they think, oh, well, hey, look at this. But the key point that I'm trying to make is that the actual price of oil and the way gasoline prices are going to be set is not based on WTI.
This brings up another interesting subject, which is something we talk about on this show, but not talked about other places really, and the idea of price propaganda, that if you create a price or you reference a price, you are shaping the discussion. You're shaping the mainstream's discussion of that element within the economy, but they're basing their entire analysis on a price that's manufactured. You know, going back to Noam Chomsky and his idea of manufacturing consent and the abuse of the mainstream media with ideas that can cause influential outcomes on the political debate. We see this now that the markets have become completely financialized, that if you can control the price, you are effectively controlling the propaganda at the same time. So what you're suggesting is that by referencing this out-of-date, antiquated price for oil, it's really completely mispreparing the population for higher prices, tighter supplies, and the phenomenon of peak oil, correct?
Sure, and it also even just confuses people more because they're going to go to the pump and they're going to see that the prices at the pump, aren't collapsing as they're being told the WTI price is collapsing on their screens. So it just sends people into more state of a confusion. They don't really know what's going on. It is in the best interest of the government and the powers that be to keep people confused because ignorant people are more easily controlled. But, the key thing, which I've written about forever and I know you've talked about, but talk about mispricing something. The most important price in any economy, in any ostensibly capitalist economy is the price of money itself. And there is no debate, zero debate. It is actually the policy of the Fed to distort and lower the cost of money to basically zero. And that is the most important price signal in an economy. So that's the craziest thing.
All right. Well, Michael Krieger, thanks so much for being on the Edge.
Thanks, Max. Always great.
And that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Kaiser. I want to thank my guest, Michael Krieger. If you want to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, this is Max Kaiser saying bye, y'all.